Hey, in the last video in the series, we looked at more traditional approaches to understanding code semantically, which involved the use of statistical language models. In addition to statistical language models, there were also RNNs and in particular LSTM networks. However, when considering the pipeline more deeply, it is obvious that it is very segregated, right? Because you have to develop the AST, so the abstract syntax trees, and then you have to put them through an RNN model and then through a general language model. So this complex pipeline would obviously result in a loss of performance unless it is dealt with very carefully. Now, in order to have a more flexible and an easier pipeline to work with, in this video we'll be looking at neural language models, in particular transformer architectures, which can help us achieve the goal of understanding code semantically and to develop Codenote as a platform. Now, if we follow the standard NLP procedure, we would obviously have to process our corpus or our data set. Well, in this case, normal word embeddings wouldn't actually work. You would have to add in another step known as Byte Pair Encoding, or BEP for short. So BEPs are mainly used to actually shrink the size of the vocabulary. And how this is achieved is by actually segregating various parts of a word into various subunits that can basically be attached together to create a new word. However, in the vocabulary, you can basically create various combinations of these subunits of words. So you may be wondering why this process known as BEP is actually being used. Well, this is because there's so many words when dealing with programming languages that cannot be captured into a dictionary or tokenized when trying to come up with word embeddings. So if you take a look at the Python language, for example, there's keywords like elif, right, which is essentially just else and if. However, for very small variations within a word like elif or else if, the computer wouldn't actually be able to understand that this is basic constitutes of else and if. So this is where byte pair encoding comes along, which essentially breaks down the word elif into two different subparts. So there'd be an if and then an L. So obviously, if there's a if in there, it would obviously link it closely with another if statement, right? So this is just a way of actually compressing the amount of, or compressing or minimizing the amount of tokens we would have to generate when trying to embed or create word embeddings. And this is particularly useful in dealing with code because there are a nearly infinite amount of combinations, right? When you're dealing with code variables and things like that. Also, in this context, what is meant by tokenization is essentially taking every single word within the data set. So let's say if you're looking at a normal English paragraph, then for every single unique word, you would actually categorize it numerically, right? So let's say A would be one word, then bird would be two words, would be word number 2, and then let's say bird appears somewhere else, well, that would essentially be assigned the value 2 again, right? And then from there, we're able to create these word embeddings. And we there's a multitude of different processes like word2vec, which creates word vectors, right? And there's a multitude of processes which don't really pertain to this particular model or this particular pipeline. So Google has released a library or a model called sentence trees, which is essentially a tokenizer that uses BPE to actually create tokens and actually create word embeddings. So this is quite a nice tool to use when dealing with BEP tokenization. And BEP tokenization actually not only used when dealing with programming languages, which is still quite a niche area, but it's used when dealing with non-English languages in general, which a particular model does not support natively. Now that we have understood BEP encodings and why they're so useful when dealing with code, we can move on to the next step, which is dealing with the language model itself. And in this case, we'll be particularly covering transformer architecture. So if we look at traditionally, the traditional practices traditionally, RNNs and in particular LSTMs have been the go-to choice for completing a whole host of NLP tasks. However, in recent times, right from about 2017 or 2018, a new architecture or process known as transformers have picked up quite a bit of steam. And you may actually have heard of some of these very popular transformer architecture models. And these are Google's BERT and OpenAI's GPT and GPT-2. In addition, Facebook has also released Roberta, and Microsoft has also their own transformer model. Now, transformers today have become the go-to choice for a whole host of NLP tasks, replacing RNNs and LSTMs effectively because of their remarkable performance. Now, to actually understand how transformers are different and how they're able to achieve a better performance, we actually have to understand the architecture themselves and how it's inherently different when compared to RNNs. So the basic building blocks of transformers are encoder and decoding blocks, right? So these are basically blocks that contain various layers within them. Now, it is important to know that some models are completely encoder-based, while some of them are completely decoder-based. For example, the OpenAI GPT-2 is completely decoder-based. And this actually works just fine, and it actually depends on what type of tasks the model is trying to accomplish and trying to determine decoder versus encoder or a mix of both. So when you look at each stack of either encoder or decoder blocks, we're basically able to find this layer called the attention mechanism. And this was actually introduced in a groundbreaking paper by Google, which introduced BERT as well, called Attention is All You Need. So what this means is that instead of using a classical architecture like RNN, where everything is linear, and what I mean by that is basically the states are passed along in a linear manner. So if it's trying to encode or trying to predict the next word, it would have to consider the word right before it, right? And then for the second word, for the third word, it would have to consider second word, and for the fourth word, it would be the third word. So this actually creates a very linear relationship between the words, and it basically assumes that the word that comes before or the word that comes after, which is the case in n-gram models, are basically the most important ones pertaining to the context of that particular word, right? So let's say I have a word, so the two words around that word are assumed to be the two most important, or the four most important words in this case, most important words in order to understand the context of that one word in the middle. Right. However, we can see that when it comes to long sentences, this may not entirely hold true and become less and less accurate. And this is particularly tough when considering programming languages, because some lines of code can be extremely long. Therefore, using this attention mechanism, transformers are much better at this task inherently. Now, the transformer architecture has actually exploded in popularity largely because of general language models. So, as I mentioned, general language models are models like GPT-2 and Google's BERT, right? And what this means is that these models have been trained on huge corpuses, right? These have been trained on massive libraries for a countless amount of hours and using a lot of resources, which is pretty much infeasible for an individual or startup. However, because of the resources allocated to these companies, they've basically trained these huge models, or they've essentially pre-trained them. And then in order to apply these models to a very particular task, like let's say in our case, using programming languages, we can basically fine-tune them. So what this means is that we're able to essentially copy all the weights from that model and copy its architecture, and then from there we're basically able to train it again using our own labeled data. So this would essentially take a general model and then train it in a particular domain to make it very accurate in that particular domain. So in the case of Codenote, we would essentially take a general model like BERT and train it on a code base found on GitHub containing for a particular programming language like Python per se. So this approach to understanding programming languages at a semantical level can be better done using neural language models because of all the reasons discussed above. So using these neural language models, in particular the general language models, and fine-tuning them for our particular purpose saves a ton of resources and as well as a ton of time. In addition, it provides a very feasible way to get this platform up and running as soon as possible. Whereas in the case of using a statistical model, we would have to first of all develop a very complex pipeline. And in addition, the whole process of using such primarily statistical language models has been outdated, right? So now with the rise of deep learning and the rise of transformers, we can essentially leverage them to boost performance and make the whole training process more efficient. And this has actually been explored by two research papers, which I'll link below, which I found pretty cool. And they essentially, so one of them compares the use of a general language model trained on a particular data set, and shows that it actually compares better when using an LSTM, RNN network, and a whole host of other networks like a TRIA CNN. And it was actually really interesting to see the differences in result, even with very little training of the BERT model. And it's not only that. So a startup company known as Tab9, which is developing a developer tool, is actually leveraging OpenAI's GPT-2 model to essentially create a deep learning driven code completion software, which has actually been pretty cool. So I'll actually link that below too, and I'll see you guys in the next video where we take a look at another cool or interesting concept pertaining to Codenote.